Welcome back everyone to the Quick Tips series. It took a while because I was on a movie and that took all of my time, but I'm back now with some more tutorials, so I'm hoping you find this helpful still. This video is about cleaning up your MIDI. So what is it and why do we need it? So once you're done writing your score in your digital audio workstation and you have everything approved by the production, the music needs to go to the orchestrator and the copyist because they need to make the sheet music to be recorded by the orchestra. So that music prep team will work from your audio reference and from your MIDI. But in order for them to work from your MIDI, you really need to give them a cleaned up version of it. Because when we make mockups, we usually create fairly messy sessions just for sound purposes, but there's a lot of information that the orchestrators are not going to need. So the first thing you want to do is quantize. Quantize the front ends of your notes, quantize the back ends of your notes. Any overlaps that you had in there to trigger legato samples, those need to go. Because when they import your MIDI into a Sibelius or Finale or Dorico, it needs to look as clean as possible. And if you leave those overlaps in or you don't quantize, it's just going to look really, really messy when they import that into their notation software. For those quantize functions, you can set key commands. I've set them up in Cubase here, but you can also set them up in Logic as far as I remember. I don't know about DP, but I'm fairly certain they must have a key command for that as well. Then the second step that you can do, or should do, is get rid of all the doublings that you put in there for mockups. For example, something I do a lot is I just copy paste a lot of my string lines from one library to another just to improve the mockup sound. But obviously an orchestrator doesn't need 60 string tracks. All they need is, everything once. So I get rid of any doublings that I put in there that I don't really want notated in the score, but that were really just for sound purposes, just to reduce the amount of tracks that the orchestrators are going to see. Something I also do is when I see that I have a second violin one line, but there's really only one note difference where they would split into Divisi, I just copy that over into the other line and just have it on one track to show the orchestrator this is just a very short Divisi passage. Instead of giving them the same track twice with just one note different, it's way easier for them that way. Then if you haven't done this already, you should name all of your tracks. I usually simplify my track names because I often have stuff in my track names that are irrelevant for the orchestrators, like what the mod wheel does or what Keyswitches I have activated for what articulation. They don't really need to know that in this case. So if something is really just a violin one legato, that's how I name that track. All the other information I put in the track name, I just take it out. You should also predetermine what needs recording, because very often we don't record everything, or at least not at the orchestra sessions. Some things are tracked at the studio in-house, and some instruments are just never recorded. So you want to look at what are we actually going to record and really drag those instruments to the top of the session and drag everything that's not going to be recorded to the bottom. This also goes for articulations that you're not going to record. For example, sometimes I have, string pizzicatos or colegnos going on while the strings are actually playing shorts or longs on top of that. Then I will not have the colegnos and pizzicatos recorded because first of all, the samples sound great, but secondly, it's about being efficient with your recording time. If we already have a limited amount of time booked and we want to really work on stuff that is important, I also drag things to the bottom that we do have instruments for, but that I really feel we don't need to record. With the rest, you should try and put everything in score order. Very often it's not the exact score order because, for example, very often on my scores we don't record the percussion, or if we do, it's just small tracking sessions at my studio. So for the orchestra, very often we record on my scores woodwinds, brass, and strings, and then occasionally piano, celeste, and harp. So those you want to have in score order for sure. Everything else gets dragged to the bottom. Some composers also like to create a separate do not use track. So they create a MIDI track with, an empty region on it that just says do not use, and then everything below that track is basically everything the orchestrator does not have to orchestrate. It's just there for information purposes. Because most orchestrators do like to have everything. They like to see everything, even though they're not going to orchestrate everything. Because something they like to do is put reference tracks into the conductor score. So when I get a score back from them, very often if I have a cue with strings and piano, they will still notate the piano even if we're not recording it. So they would like to determine cue by cue what reference they're going to put into the score and what just gets left out. Another thing you can do as a courtesy to the orchestrator is give them a list of what your key switches do. Ideally, you have your whole template set up that all the key switches always do the same. If they don't, it would be nice to give the orchestrators a list. Same thing if you use program changes and that type of thing. Be nice and try to make their job easier by telling them what's what. Of course, they have very good ears, so very often they can determine by ear what it is. But, just to be on the safe side, it's always better to avoid questions and give them that information. I personally use split patches, so every articulation is on its separate track most of the time. So I don't need to do that because they can just see in the track name what it is. It's kind of a nicer way for the orchestrators to do it that way, but you don't have to. But if you don't, make it easy for them. We usually also print anything separately that is one MIDI note, but where stuff is going on that they have to transcribe by ear. So if I have some kind of orchestral effect thing going on, but it's just one MIDI note, but all kinds of stuff happens, I print that on a separate track for them in the audio, just so they can hear the audio separately that goes with that one MIDI line. Because otherwise, how are they going to transcribe it? Though I have to say very often we don't actually get orchestral effects recorded, but that's a personal choice. There are also some orchestrators that prefer to have all the sections separately, so they would like all the strings on one audio track, all the brass on one audio track, all the percussion, all the woodwinds. I understand that, so if an orchestrator is particularly adamant about that, wanting that, by all means give it to them. It might make things easier because they don't have to hear the mockup as a whole. It's particularly important if your mockups aren't very good or very clear, to give elements separately. I usually don't do that unless it's really necessary, because usually the mockups that come out of my studio are about 90% of what the final product will be. So it's not really necessary. Everything should be audible. But if I have a feeling that in one piece or two it's not audible, I will print them separately. And then the last step for me is I delete the MIDI flags. If you're using MIDI flags, be sure to delete them, because you only want the tracks with data on them exported, of course, and not all the tracks in your template. Don't give 1,000 tracks to your orchestrator. That's just a douchey move. Don't do it. And then the last step is exporting all the MIDI. Be sure to include the tempo map. Be sure to include markers. They kind of like to see those. But other than that, just a regular standard MIDI file. And you send that off with the audio files. And then hopefully you will get a PDF file back with a correct score that you would then proofread. And then once it's all approved, it would go to the copyist, and the copyist would make the instrument parts for the players. And then that's the end of that process.